The morning the truth almost came out, I was standing on my own porch holding a stranger's electricity bill, a birthday card addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield, and 7 years of a lie so gentle it had become the closest thing to a family I had ever known. Before I tell you how a mail carrier's simple mistake turned two lonely neighbors into the closest thing to a married couple this town had ever seen without a single wedding vow between them, I want to ask you something, because I think you already know the answer in your heart. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in second chances, in the quiet ways two broken people can put each other back together without ever meaning to, then please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who could use a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel, because our community is built on stories exactly like this one, and I promise you, this one will stay with you long after it ends. My name is Margaret Hollis, though everyone on Larkspur Lane has called me Meg since the day I moved in, and this is the story of how a clerical error at the post office rewrote the second half of my life. I was 43 years old when I bought the little blue house at the end of the cul-de-sac, a woman recently divorced, recently unemployed from a marketing job I had given 12 years of my life to, and recently convinced that the best chapters of my story had already been written and closed. My ex-husband, Rowan, had left for a woman 15 years younger than either of us, and he had done it so quietly, so without drama, that I almost respected the efficiency of it, the way you respect a surgeon who removes something diseased without wasting a single motion. I took what savings I had left, sold the house we shared, and bought a smaller one in a town I had visited exactly once, because the real estate listing had a photograph of a garden with roses climbing a white trellis, and something about that image made me believe I could still grow something beautiful even after everything else had wilted. The house next to mine belonged to a man named Desmond Cartwright, a widower in his late 40s who kept his lawn immaculate and his curtains closed, and who nodded at me exactly once during my first month there before disappearing back into whatever silence he lived inside. I later learned that his wife, Camille, had died 3 years earlier after a long illness, the kind that takes a person slowly enough that grief has time to set its roots deep before the funeral even happens. Desmond had 2 teenage children when I moved in, a son named Julian who was 17 and already taller than his father, and a daughter named Poppy who was 14 and carried herself with the particular wariness of a girl who had learned too early that mothers do not always stay. I did not know any of this yet on the day the mailman first knocked on my door holding a parcel addressed to D. Cartwright at my address instead of his, because our house numbers, as it turned out, were 14 and 14A, and the postal system in our town had apparently never quite worked out the difference. I walked the parcel over myself that first time, because it seemed like the neighborly thing to do, and Desmond answered the door with the wary politeness of a man unused to visitors, thanked me in 3 words, and closed the door before I had even finished saying it was no trouble at all. I remember standing on his porch for a moment afterward, feeling foolish, wondering if I had imagined some warmth in him that simply was not there, and telling myself that some people build walls for good reasons and it is not a stranger's job to tear them down. But the mail mix-ups did not stop. They happened again the following week, and then the week after that, a misdelivered water bill, a coupon mailer, a jury duty summons that made us both laugh nervously on his doorstep for the first time, wondering aloud whether the county now believed we shared a single identity. It became a kind of ritual, this walking back and forth between our 2 front doors, a parcel or an envelope in hand, a few words exchanged, a little more each time, like 2 people slowly learning the shape of a bridge by walking across it again and again until it stopped feeling unfamiliar. I want to tell you honestly that nothing about this began as romance, because I think the truth of it is more beautiful than any manufactured spark could be. What began was friendship, built brick by brick out of small kindnesses that neither of us asked for and neither of us expected to need. There was the afternoon I saw Poppy crying on the porch steps because a group of girls at school had mocked her for wearing her mother's old cardigan, and I sat down beside her without a word until she was ready to talk, and when she finally did, I listened the way I wished someone had listened to me during my own hardest years. There was the evening Julian's car broke down 2 streets over and Desmond was away on a business trip, and it was Julian who knocked on my door, hesitant and embarrassed, asking if I might be able to give him a ride, and it was me who sat in a mechanic's waiting room with him for 2 hours, buying him a soda from the vending machine and listening to him talk about a college he was afraid to apply to because he did not think he deserved it. There was the week I came down with a fever bad enough that I could not get out of bed, and it was Desmond who left a pot of soup on my doorstep every single day without ever once knocking to check if I noticed, until the day I finally caught him mid-delivery and he looked so startled, so caught out in an act of tenderness he had not meant to be seen doing, that I almost laughed through my fever just at the expression on his face. It was Poppy, in fact, who started the rumor, though she never meant it as one. She was 12, no, 14 by then, and she had mentioned to a friend at school that my dad's neighbor Meg had helped her with a school project, and somewhere between one telling and the next, neighbor became stepmom, became, eventually, simply mom, because children speak in the shorthand of what they wish were true rather than what technically is. The friend told her own mother, the mother mentioned it at a block party while I happened to be standing 3 feet away holding a plate of deviled eggs, and I did not correct her fast enough, because I was too stunned by the casual certainty in her voice, the way she said, "You and Desmond," as though it were as obvious as the color of the sky. By the time I found the nerve to say anything, the conversation had already moved on to someone's renovation permits, and the moment for correction had quietly closed itself like a door I hadn't realized was swinging shut. I told myself I would clear it up eventually, that it was a harmless misunderstanding that would fade on its own, the way most gossip does when it isn't fed. But our town, you have to understand, was small enough that stories did not fade so much as they calcified. The mailman, a cheerful and slightly overworked man named Foster Higgins, had apparently begun writing Cartwright Hollis on packages he wasn't sure how to sort, a habit he picked up sometime in our second year of knowing each other, and once that name started appearing on parcels, it began appearing in conversations too. The woman at the pharmacy asked how my husband's blood pressure medication was working out. The pastor at the small church I occasionally attended referred to us once, warmly and without malice, as one of our strongest families. Even the school administration, when Poppy needed a guardian signature for a field trip and Desmond was traveling, called my house first, assuming, reasonably enough given everything they had heard, that I would simply sign as her mother. I want to be honest with you about the shame I carried during those years, because I think shame is part of what makes a story true. I was ashamed that I had let a lie grow simply by failing to correct it in time, ashamed that some quiet, hungry part of me liked being mistaken for someone's wife, someone's mother, someone who belonged fully and completely inside a family rather than orbiting one from the house next door. I had spent so many years feeling like a woman whose usefulness had expired, first as an employee laid off after 12 loyal years, then as a wife discarded for someone younger, that the accidental mistaking of me for a beloved matriarch felt, God forgive me, like a kind of mercy I did not want to give back. And yet every time I opened my mouth to correct someone, the words felt like they would cost something enormous, not just to me but to Desmond and to those 2 children who had already lost one mother and who seemed, in their own careful and unspoken way, to be leaning on the fiction of a second one. Desmond and I never discussed the rumor directly for the first 2 years, which I know sounds impossible, but you have to understand the particular etiquette of 2 wounded people who have learned that questions can open wounds faster than they close them. We simply continued as we had, borrowing sugar and returning casserole dishes, watching each other's homes when one of us traveled, attending Julian's baseball games and Poppy's recitals side by side in a way that looked, to any outside observer, exactly like a marriage, because in every practical sense, it functioned like one. I learned the specific way Desmond took his coffee, dark and unsweetened, a holdover from a father who had taught him that sugar was for people who hadn't yet learned to appreciate bitterness. He learned that I could not sleep with any light in the room except a single humming nightlight in the hallway, a habit from childhood I had never quite shaken and had never told another living soul about, until one ordinary Tuesday I mentioned it in passing and he simply nodded and never brought it up again, except that the next time I stayed over during a power outage at my own house, sleeping on his guest bed while a storm rattled the windows, I noticed he had placed a small battery lamp in the hallway before I ever asked. It was Poppy who eventually asked the question none of the adults had been brave enough to ask, and she did it on an ordinary Saturday afternoon while we were repotting tomato plants in my backyard, her hands deep in soil, her eyes fixed determinately on the roots she was untangling rather than on my face, which I think was a mercy on her part, giving me somewhere else to look while she spoke. She asked me, in the careful voice of someone who has rehearsed a question many times before finally releasing it into the air, whether I loved her father. I remember the trowel going still in my hand, the sun warm on the back of my neck, a bee investigating the lavender 2 feet away as though nothing enormous had just happened. I told her the truth, which was that I did not know how to answer a question that large without either lying to her or admitting something to myself that I was not yet ready to admit, and she nodded slowly, the way children do when they have decided an adult's uncertainty is itself a kind of answer, and she said, so quietly I almost missed it over the bee's droning, that she hoped I did, because she had already lost one mother and did not think she had it in her to lose a second one who was never even really hers to lose in the first place. I cried that night after she went home, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold, because her words had cracked something open in me that I had spent years carefully sealing shut. I understood, in that moment, that whatever this arrangement had started as a postal error, a town's careless assumption, a story too convenient to correct, it had become something with real weight, real consequences, real hearts inside it that could be broken if I mishandled what I did next. I thought about my ex-husband, about the particular loneliness of being unwanted by someone who once promised forever, and I thought about how strange it was that I had found, entirely by accident, a version of forever that no one had promised me at all, and yet here it was anyway, growing in my backyard alongside the tomatoes. The turning point, the moment the whole fragile architecture of our unspoken arrangement nearly collapsed, came in our 5th year, when Desmond's sister, a sharp-tongued woman named Rosalind who lived 2 states away and visited perhaps twice a year, arrived for Julian's high school graduation and discovered, to her genuine horror, that the woman everyone in town referred to as her brother's wife did not, in fact, share his last name, his bed, his tax return, or any legal document whatsoever. Rosalind was not a cruel woman, but she was a blunt one, and she confronted Desmond in his own kitchen while I happened to be there setting out plates for the graduation party, asking him in a voice too loud for the thin walls whether he understood what he was doing to his children, letting them believe in a family that existed only in the town's imagination, letting a woman who was not their mother sign school forms and attend parent conferences and love them in ways that carried no legal weight and could be withdrawn at any moment with no more consequence than a neighbor moving away. I remember Desmond's face during that conversation, the particular stillness of a man who has been caught between 2 truths he cannot reconcile, and I remember excusing myself to the backyard because I could not bear to watch him struggle to defend something neither of us had ever properly named. Julian found me out there first, 17 years old and about to graduate, still in the collared shirt his father had ironed for him that morning, and he sat down beside me on the porch steps without a word, the same way I had once sat beside his sister. And after a while he said that he did not care what Aunt Rosalind thought family was supposed to look like on paper, because he knew what it looked like in practice, and it looked like me driving 2 hours to watch his baseball games in the rain, and it looked like me teaching his sister to bake bread because their mother never got the chance to, and it looked like me sitting with his father in comfortable silence on a porch swing most evenings, 2 people who had each been left behind once and had somehow, without ever discussing it, decided not to leave each other behind again. I will not pretend that Rosalind's words did not do damage, because they did. She was not wrong, in the strictest sense, that we had built something without a foundation anyone could point to, no marriage license, no legal guardianship, nothing but years of accumulated trust and the town's willingness to believe in something simpler than the truth. Desmond and I did not speak of it again that week, both of us retreating into a politeness that felt, for the first time in years, like distance rather than comfort, and I remember lying awake at night wondering if this was the moment everything unraveled, if I would soon be nothing more than the woman who used to live next door, a story people told about a misunderstanding rather than a family anyone believed in. What changed everything was not a grand gesture but a small, almost accidental one, the way the truest turning points in life so often are. Poppy had a piano recital that same month, her first solo performance after years of lessons she had nearly quit twice, and I had promised to attend before any of the trouble with Rosalind had started. On the morning of the recital, Desmond called me, his voice careful in a way that told me he had rehearsed what he was about to say, and he told me that he would understand completely if I felt I needed to step back, given everything Rosalind had said, given how complicated and undefined everything between us truly was. I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone, looking out at the garden with its roses climbing the white trellis, the same roses that had drawn me to this house in the first place, and I told him that I had already promised his daughter I would be there, and that I did not intend to let a stranger's opinion about paperwork undo years of showing up for people who mattered to me. I heard him exhale on the other end of the line, a sound that carried more relief than words could have, and he said, quietly, that he had hoped I would say exactly that. Poppy played her piece that afternoon in a school auditorium with too much fluorescent lighting and folding chairs that creaked whenever anyone shifted their weight, and I sat between Desmond and Julian in the third row, and when Poppy found us afterward, flushed with the particular pride of a nervous child who has just done something hard and done it well, she did not run to her father first, and she did not run to me first. She simply ran to the space between us, throwing one arm around each of our waists at once, as though we were already one thing rather than two people the town had merely decided to call one thing. I think that was the moment I finally understood what Rosalind had missed in her otherwise fair critique, that family is not only the paperwork that names it but the daily, unglamorous, unwitnessed choosing of each other that happens long before anyone thinks to write anything down. Still, the question of what we actually were to each other did not resolve itself simply because a piano recital had moved me to tears. Desmond and I spent the following weeks in a strange, tender limbo, closer than we had ever admitted and yet still careful never to name it, two people circling a truth neither of us felt entitled to claim first. I had been the one left behind once already, and some frightened part of me could not shake the fear that naming this thing between us, giving it a word like love or partnership or marriage, would be the very thing that made it fragile enough to break. Desmond, I later learned, carried a mirror image of the same fear, having built his entire understanding of loss around the slow decline of a wife he had loved since he was 22 years old, and having promised himself in the raw months after her funeral that he would never again let himself hope for something permanent, because permanence, in his experience, was the thing life reserved the right to take away without warning. It was Julian, on the eve of leaving for college, who finally forced the conversation none of us had been brave enough to start. He came to my door alone one evening, his acceptance letter to a state university folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft, and he told me that he had spent his whole final year of high school watching his father and me dance around a truth that every single person in this town already believed, and he did not understand what either of us were waiting for. He said that he had lost his mother slowly, watching her fade for years before she was finally gone, and that the not knowing, the drawn-out uncertainty of loving someone whose future was never guaranteed, had taught him that certainty, wherever you can find it, wherever you can build it honestly with your own two hands, is worth grabbing hold of rather than postponing out of fear. He said this while standing on my porch in the fading gold light of a summer evening, his backpack already half packed for a dormitory 200 miles away, and I remember thinking that this boy, barely 18, had somehow arrived at a wisdom that had taken me 48 years and one failed marriage to even begin to approach. I went to Desmond's house that same evening, walking the short distance between our two front doors that I had walked 1,000 times before, first carrying misdelivered mail, later carrying casseroles and books and, once, an entire ladder when his gutters needed clearing. I found him sitting on his back porch, watching the light fade over a yard that still held the swing set his children had long since outgrown but that neither of us had ever suggested taking down. I sat beside him without asking permission, the way I had learned to do over 7 years of quiet, accumulated intimacy, and I told him what Julian had said, and I watched something shift in his face, some old, careful defense finally loosening its grip. He told me, that evening, about Camille, more openly than he ever had before, about the particular guilt of a man who has grieved his first wife thoroughly and yet still finds himself, years later, capable of loving someone new, as though love were a finite resource that betrayed the dead simply by continuing to exist. I told him about Rowan, about the specific humiliation of being replaced rather than simply losing someone, about how I had spent years afterward believing that whatever made me lovable had expired along with my marriage. We sat there long enough that the sky moved from gold to a deep, soft blue, the kind of light that comes right before true dark, and I remember thinking that I had promised myself, and this story, that everything important would happen in daylight, and so it felt right, somehow, that this conversation, too, unfolded entirely in the last generous hour before evening properly fell, As though the day itself were reluctant to end until we had finally said what needed saying. Desmond took my hand that evening, the first deliberately romantic gesture either of us had allowed ourselves in 7 years of near marriage, and he said that he did not want to spend whatever years he had left being mistaken for a husband he had never actually become, not because the mistake bothered him, but because I deserved better than an accident of postal geography standing in for a genuine choice. He said that he loved me, plainly, without hedging, the way a man says something he has known for a long time but has been too afraid to test out loud, and he asked, in words almost identical to the ones this story's title promises, whether I would make it official, whether I would consider actually marrying him, not the town's version of us, not the mail carrier's shorthand, not the story other people had told about two neighbors who behaved like spouses, but an actual marriage, built now with full and open eyes, by two people who had already spent 7 years proving to each other, in 1,000 small unglamorous ways, that they were capable of showing up. I want to tell you that I said yes immediately, but the truth is I asked for a little time, not because I doubted my feelings, but because I wanted to be certain I was saying yes to Desmond and not simply to the comfort of finally having an answer to a question the whole town had been asking on my behalf for years. I spent 2 weeks walking the same garden path past my roses, turning the question over the way you turn a stone to see every side of it in the light, and what I found, every single time, was the same steady truth, that I loved this man not because our mail had once been confused, not because our neighbors expected it, not because his children needed a mother figure, but because he had spent 7 years choosing me quietly and without fanfare, in soup left on doorsteps and battery lamps placed in hallways, and 100 small proofs that he saw me clearly and had decided, deliberately, that I was worth staying for. If this story has moved you even a little, I want to ask you to pause for just a moment and leave a comment about what part touched you most, whether it was Poppy's question in the garden, or Julian's wisdom on the porch, or the simple, quiet accumulation of small kindnesses that built a real family out of what began as nothing more than a postal mistake, because I read every single comment, and I think the lessons in this story belong as much to you now as they do to me. We were married the following spring, on a Saturday morning chosen deliberately for its daylight, in the same backyard where Poppy and I had once repotted tomatoes and where she had asked me, with soil still under her fingernails, whether I loved her father. Foster Higgins, our mail carrier, was among the guests, and he stood up during the reception, uninvited but welcomed anyway, to tell the story of the very first misdelivered parcel, the water bill and the jury summons and the eventual, deliberate way he had started writing Cartwright Hollis on our packages long before either of us had earned the right to that name, because, he said, he had watched us building something real long before we had the courage to call it real ourselves, and he wanted to be the first, officially, to get the address right. Rosalind came too, her earlier bluntness softened into something like humility, and she pulled me aside during the reception to say that she had been wrong to measure our family only by the paperwork it lacked, and that she was glad, genuinely and without reservation, to finally see the foundation made solid beneath everything she had once feared was built on sand. Julian gave a short, unrehearsed toast that made half the guests cry, saying simply that he had lost his mother slowly and gained a second one strangely, through an error at the post office of all things, and that he had come to believe that the strangest beginnings sometimes produced the truest endings, because nothing about the accident of our meeting had mattered nearly as much as the 7 years of choice that followed it. Poppy, 17 by then and no longer the wary girl who had cried on porch steps over a hand-me-down cardigan, stood beside me as I got ready that morning, helping me with a string of pearls that had belonged to my own mother, and she told me, with the same quiet directness she had shown years earlier among the tomatoes, that she no longer thought of me as her stepmother or her father's neighbor or any of the words other people had used to describe what I was to her. She simply thought of me as her mother, full stop, no qualifiers needed, and I have never in my life been given a gift I treasured more. I think often, now, about the 7 years before that wedding, about how easily I might have corrected the rumor the very first time it surfaced at that block party with the deviled eggs, how simple it would have been to say, politely and immediately, that Desmond and I were only neighbors, nothing more, and how different every single year that followed might have looked if I had. I do not believe, looking back, that the lie itself was ever the important part of this story. What mattered was what grew in the space the misunderstanding accidentally created, the daily proximity that let two guarded, grieving people discover, slowly and without pressure, that they were safe with each other. I think sometimes life hands us a door we never asked to walk through, a postal error, a chance meeting, a mistaken assumption at a party, and the real test of our character is not whether the door was opened correctly, but what we choose to build once we are standing inside the room it leads to. If this story touched your heart even a little, I want to ask you directly and sincerely to like this video, to leave a comment about the moment that moved you most, to share it with someone in your life who might need a reminder today that hope and second chances are real, and to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one, because our family here, the one built around these stories we tell each other, matters to me every bit as much as the family I found on Larkspur Lane. Desmond and I still live in that same blue house with the roses on the white trellis, though the trellis has needed rebuilding twice now and the roses have long since spread further than either of us originally planted them. Julian is finishing his degree 200 miles away but still calls every Sunday, and Poppy is applying to colleges herself now, carrying with her a confidence I do not think she would have found if a mail carrier's confusion had never brought two lonely houses close enough together to become one home. Foster Higgins still delivers our mail most days, and he still writes Cartwright Hollis across the top of every parcel, though now, of course, it is no longer a mistake at all, simply the truth, printed in careful letters by a man who somehow saw what we would become long before we allowed ourselves to see it in each other. And some mornings, when I walk out to collect the mail and find his handwriting waiting there in blue ink, I think about how strange and generous life can be, how the smallest clerical error, the tiniest crack in an ordinary system, can sometimes let enough light in to grow an entire second chapter of your life, more solid and more true than anything you could have planned on your own, if only you are brave enough, when someone finally asks you to make it official, to say yes.